In 2008, the world witnessed a financial collapse that altered the global economy. What many didn't realize was that the roots of this crisis began with a discrete agreement, far from the spotlight. The story begins in an environment that seemed stable and prosperous, but hid deep-seated tensions beneath the surface. The real estate sector in the United States was booming, and banks were excited, offering loans to anyone who wanted them. The idea that property was a safe bet spread like wildfire. However, this euphoria brought with it questionable practices. Banks began packaging high-risk mortgages into securities that were sold as safe investments. The logic was simple. If a sufficient number of people paid their mortgages, the system would be solid. But the reality was quite different. Many of these mortgages were granted to borrowers who could not afford to pay them, what we call subprime. The promise of quick profit began to overshadow common sense. The first sign that something was wrong appeared when default rates started to rise. The confidence that once dominated the market began to falter. But as panic began to creep into investors' minds, the true catalyst of the crisis was still silently forming. A seemingly harmless agreement between two major banks was the spark that ignited a fire. They decided it was time to restructure, and this restructuring involved the sale of large quantities of mortgage-backed securities. This move was a devastating blow to the market. The mass sale of these mortgages began to devalue financial assets, exposing the system's fragility. As prices fell, banks began to panic, and liquidity dried up. Trust, which was already tenuous, broke. What seemed to be a simple restructuring agreement turned into a chain reaction, leading to the bankruptcy of renowned financial institutions. Lehman Brothers, one of the pillars of the financial system, couldn't recover from this blow. Its bankruptcy in September 2008 was a milestone. The domino effect began to spread, hitting banks and companies around the world. What was once an isolated collapse now became a global crisis. People started losing their jobs, their homes, and their savings. Panic took over the streets and Wall Street. Governments and central banks were forced to act. Billion-dollar rescue packages were presented in an attempt to stabilize markets and restore confidence. What followed were years of austerity and recession, while the echoes of the 2008 collapse still resonate in the modern economy. What started as a quiet agreement turned into a painful lesson about the interconnectedness of the financial system. These events are not just a story of the past. They teach us about the risks of blind trust in the market. The fragility of the financial system was exposed, and the 2008 crisis became an indelible reminder that in economics, nothing is as secure as it seems. What lies beneath the surface can be a warning sign of what is to come. The story of the 2008 collapse shows us that behind every great crisis, there are silent agreements that can trigger catastrophic consequences. The 2008 collapse was not an isolated event. It was the result of a series of decisions made over the years, driven by a culture of greed and complacency. What was once considered a robust real estate market turned into fertile ground for speculation. Banks, in their relentless pursuit of profits, were willing to overlook the risks embedded in their financial products. One of the main culprits behind the crisis was the practice of mortgage securitization. Banks started bundling mortgages into packages and selling them as securities, allowing investors from all over the world to participate in the U.S. housing market. These securities were often rated as safe by rating agencies, which, in many cases, failed to recognize the risks associated with these assets. As a result, many investors were drawn to a market that seemed promising, without understanding the true nature of the products they were acquiring. Meanwhile, borrowers were being encouraged to buy homes they could not afford. Banks offered attractive, but often obscure, financing terms. Adjustable-rate mortgages, for example, offered low initial payments but quickly increased, placing unsustainable pressure on borrowers. The combination of high-risk loans and irresponsible financing practices created a perfect storm for the crisis. As default rates grew, banks began to realize their bets were risky. Instead of correcting course, many opted to conceal the issues. They started using complex accounting techniques to hide losses, forgetting that the truth always comes out. This lack of transparency fueled distrust among financial institutions and investors. The lack of confidence spread like a virus, and the system was already on the brink of collapse. In 2007, the crisis began to show more evident signs. Home prices started to fall, and people began losing their homes. What was once a thriving industry quickly turned into an emergency situation. The first signs of a collapse came with the bankruptcies of smaller institutions that were already showing liquidity problems. These events were ignored by many, but they should have served as a warning. What followed was a domino effect. When Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy, panic gripped the markets. What was once a sectoral crisis quickly spread to the global economy. The government's response was slow and often inadequate. The TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program, bailout package was implemented, but many citizens felt disillusioned. The idea that taxpayers were saving financial institutions that had acted irresponsibly caused outrage. The social and economic consequences of the crisis were profound. Millions of people lost their jobs, their homes, and their faith in the financial system. The impacts of the crisis were felt worldwide. Countries that depended on the United States for trade and investment began to see their economies crumble. Europe, in particular, faced its own challenges. The collapse exposed the fragility of interconnected economies and showed that trust in a globalized system can be a double-edged sword. The years following the crisis were marked by a continuous struggle to regain stability. Unemployment rates remained high, and many citizens faced financial hardships that would take years to overcome. The lessons learned from the 2008 collapse became a recurring theme in debates about financial regulations, and many called for reforms in the banking system. Financial regulations were hotly debated, and, eventually, some changes were implemented. The Dodd-Frank Act, passed in 2010, was an attempt to prevent a similar crisis from happening again. This legislation brought a series of changes, including the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which aims to protect consumers from predatory financial practices. However, there are still many critics who argue that the reforms did not go far enough. The 2008 crisis also brought to light ethical issues in banking practices. The perception that banks prioritized profits over social responsibility generated widespread skepticism towards financial institutions. The psychological impact of the crisis was profound. Many citizens began to view the financial system as an adversary, not an ally. Today, more than a decade after the collapse, the lessons are still relevant. The study of the 2008 crisis teaches us that trust in a financial system should not be blind. Transparency, responsibility, and ethics are fundamental to economic health. The interconnectedness of global markets means that a mistake in one corner of the world can have repercussions everywhere. In short, the 2008 collapse was a milestone in modern economic history. It exposed deep flaws in a system that many believed to be unbreakable. The crisis was not just a financial event. It was a wake-up call about the fragility of our interconnected world and the importance of a deep understanding of the structures that underpin our economies. What started as a silent agreement turned into one of the most significant events in economic history, and its lessons still echo in contemporary society. As the 2008 collapse unfolded, the American government's response was marked by controversy. The TARP rescue package, which aimed to stabilize the financial sector, was implemented quickly, but its effectiveness was questioned. Many critics argued that the government was bailing out institutions that had acted irresponsibly, while millions of ordinary citizens faced financial hardships. This perception of unfairness fueled widespread discontent. The impacts of the crisis were felt across various areas of the economy. Unemployment soared, reaching alarming levels. Individuals who previously enjoyed financial stability found themselves struggling to pay bills and support their families. The housing market collapsed, resulting in mass foreclosures. Cities and communities that depended on the real estate sector to thrive were devastated, with entire neighborhoods turning into desolate zones. The collapse was not limited to the United States. Its shockwaves spread around the world. Interconnected economies began to face their own crises. Europe, in particular, saw its banks and financial institutions struggle to stay afloat. Countries like Greece, Spain, and Portugal faced debt crises that would shake their economies for years. What was seen as a localized problem quickly became a global issue. Beyond financial hardships, the crisis also had a lasting impact on public confidence in financial institutions and the government. Faith in the banking system, which was previously considered solid, was severely shaken. People began to question the transparency and ethics of banking practices. The feeling that banks were responsible for the crisis but did not face adequate consequences generated skepticism that persisted for years. In response to this distrust, social movements began to gain strength. The Occupy Wall Street movement, for example, emerged as a voice against corporate greed and economic inequality. The protests demanded changes in the financial system and advocated for greater accountability from institutions. This discontent reflected the frustration of many citizens who felt left behind amidst the economic recovery. Over time, the economy began to recover slowly, but the recovery was not uniform. While some areas prospered, others continued to face difficulties. Economic inequality deepened, with a growing disparity between the rich and the poor. The middle class, which had been a pillar of the American economy, faced significant challenges, and many began to question whether the American dream was still attainable. The lessons learned from the 2008 crisis led to an ongoing debate about financial regulation. Although the Dodd-Frank Act was an important step, many experts argue that more reforms are necessary to ensure the stability of the financial system. The need for more rigorous oversight of banking practices remains a central concern, especially in a world where financial innovations are constantly evolving. Furthermore, the crisis highlighted the importance of broader financial education. Many consumers did not fully understand the financial products they were acquiring, which left them vulnerable to predatory practices. Promoting greater financial literacy is seen as an essential measure to protect consumers and prevent similar mistakes from occurring in the future. The 2008 collapse also brought to light the need for greater international collaboration among financial regulators. In a globalized world, decisions made in one country can have significant repercussions in others. Therefore, a coordinated approach to financial regulation is crucial to avoid future global financial crises. Today, more than a decade after the crisis, the legacy of 2008 continues to influence how we view the economy and the financial system. The lessons learned serve as a constant reminder that trust should not be blind, and that accountability and transparency are fundamental to a healthy economic system. The collapse of 2008 was not just an isolated event. It was a call to action to rethink and reform a system that, in many aspects, still needs to evolve to ensure a fairer and more resilient economy. Before you leave, do two things now. Take a deep breath and hold on to what touched your heart today. And, if it makes sense, share this story with someone who also needs to hear it.